So what do you think this old symbol from the turn of the century company Western Electric has to do with the Hawthorn effect? Welcome to Psychobabble. Today we're going to be talking about the Hawthorn effect, which is a fairly well-known term in psychology, and it's sometimes often known outside of psychology, but I want to give some of the history behind it and what it means to us today. And when we talk about the Hawthorn effect, it is a part of what we learn when we are talking about social psychology and also when we talk about research methods. So we have to go a little bit back in time to the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and what was going on back then. The Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution meant that we were applying technology to the manufacturing of goods. Those goods had to be marketed and sold, mass production, and profit was now, instead of charging high prices for a small number of items, we wanted to charge low prices for a large number of items, and therefore owners of the means of production were interested in productivity, because the more product you could get out of the employees, the more profits you made. Now, the Industrial Revolution also occurred within a time of science and society that we call positivism. Now, positivism is the notion that human beings applying science can solve problems. Now, I understand that seems so kind of like, well, yeah, today. But understand that prior to that time, when we experienced problems, we were often told to pray for it, to ask for God's providence, to ask for a supernatural intervention, to hope, those kinds of things. And where science and religion collided was on the playing field of positivism. Science said, wait a minute, we don't have to ask God for this. We don't have to wait for God's providence to come to solve these problems. We can apply the scientific method to solve these problems. Now, combining the Industrial Revolution and positivism, we have a character that appears on the stage, Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor took science and applied it to solving the problem of productivity. And in 1911, he published his seminal work, which is the Principles of Scientific Management. Now, the Principles of Scientific Management simply said, by and large, that we can use scientific principles to, in the hands of administrators, of management. Management was considered the controlling factor, and it still largely is within this model. That we can take scientific principles, apply them to the workplace, and increase people's productivity. So, as this became more and more popular, companies like Western Electric said, we would like to have our employees be more productive, and therefore for every hour that our employees put into their jobs, we're making more money. We're still paying them for the same hour, but if they produce 20 of whatever it is that they're producing instead of 10, then we're making twice as much money for the amount of hours that we're paying. So if you take a company like Western Electric, you add it to a book like the Principles of Scientific Management, and what that produced was experiments on factors associated with increasing productivity. And one of those experiments occurred in the 1920s through the 1930s, a series of experiments at the Western Electric Hawthorn Works in Chicago, Illinois. Now, the one experiment that we usually talk about, because it has some relevance today in how we experience factory work and also how we experience shopping, and I get to that in just a minute, but they looked at lots of factors. They looked at not just the one that we're going to be talking about today. But for today, what we're going to examine is in the series of experiments looking at how can we manipulate the workplace in order to make our employees more productive. They looked at the brightness of the lights. Now we understand today that that is in fact true, that bright lights, particularly of certain wavelengths, will interact with the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the same apparatus inside of our brain that regulates our sleep-wake cycles, and bright lights tend to keep us more awake. Dim lights tend to calm us down. We experience that all the time. When we go shopping in the big box stores, notice how bright the lights are. The longer we stay in a big box store, the more we're going to buy. Back to our Hawthorn plant and the experiment of the lights. So here we have the conditions under which the plant exposed their employees. So you have normal lighting way over on the left-hand side, and then increasing degrees of bright light. And while they were doing this, while they were making these incremental increases to the brightness of the lights in the factory, they were interviewing the workers and asking them about their work and productivity and measuring productivity, and they kept records on those things. So at the beginning, we're looking at sort of like regular productivity. This is sort of just a graphic example, but we see, there's our regular productivity in normal lighting conditions. And what they began to see is as they changed this one variable, as they're going from relatively normal lighting up until bright lighting, they started to see an increase in productivity. Now, the degree to which this was true, they drew conclusions about this, and various factories implemented this solution. It was published, and we have it. So we have the bright light increases productivity. And there is a certain, like I was just saying about the suprachiasmatic nucleus, there is a piece of this that's very valid. However, this data was reanalyzed many years later by a person by the name of Henry Berger in 1958. And he made some interesting discoveries when he looked at the procedures, what happened, how they implemented the interventions, how they interacted with the employees, and he came to some dramatically different conclusions as to explaining the majority of the results. Remember, the results were still valid, but the majority of the change in productivity was indeed not because of the brightness of the lights. What Landsberger discovered when he reanalyzed the data was that if you have workers and the employer says we care, however that is, by asking them questions, about having conversations about their work, about measuring their productivity, about wanting to know their opinion. Every time we reach out to our employees and we gather their input, that produced increased productivity. When individuals felt that they were important enough for the management to come over and talk to, emotionally they felt more motivated, and productivity went up. So the behavior changed partially because of the lights, but mostly because the management was paying attention to them and listening to them talk about their work. Now this idea, this notion, that we now refer to as the Hawthorn Effect, is essentially when we are noticed, watched, attended, listened to, all of those things in work, our behavior changes. We can see this in small ways when the boss shows up and we act a little bit different. But in truth, it's bigger than that. It's when we know that somebody is paying attention to our work. We will work harder, more diligently, better quality, those kinds of things. These are factors that we observe all the time. Now, I said this is both an application within social psychology and research methods. So in social psychology, obviously we can see if employers want to get more productivity out of their employees, they need to involve them in the discussion. This is a big part of industrial organizational psychology as well. Now, in terms of research methods, our understanding that when somebody's being watched or noticed changes their behavior, we actually engage in practices to try and control for that factor when we're doing research. We may not be in the room when they're doing their behavior. We may have hidden cameras or something, or we might not want to watch when the actual behavior is happening, or at least we don't want them to know we're watching, because the fact that we're looking at them changes their behavior. We recognize that through the Hawthorn Effect. Now, Frederick Taylor's influence, however, his idea of the scientific applications in management remain with us today in a field that we call Taylorism. Now, Taylorism is, as a specific field of study, is gone. But the principles that they embodied remain with us today in different forms of management theory, leadership theory, organizational change, and organizational cultural theories and whatnot, that we see how people are productive and how people work and how they interact with one another. Now, the basic premise of Taylorism is that management was in charge and that workers could not be trusted to monitor their own behavior. So that was the mindset. Keep in mind where this came from. Turn of the century, we had fairly uneducated workers operating a machine. They largely didn't understand that machine. They're largely illiterate, largely used to work on the farm, and now they're working in the factory, and they just need to be told what to do. They're basically seen as part of the machine. And that's, part of the sort of human drawback of that kind of work is the diminishing of the human being. But those were the facts of the day. This, of course, is somewhat modified today. I mean, our workers are much more appreciated today in most industries. But to the degree in which they're viewed as part of the machine, these principles continue to apply in industrial organizational psych. So some of the principles that Taylorism has put forth that are still with us today include analysis, using data to actually analyze how a business is doing. We still see that today. We synthesize this information into coherent packets so that managers and middle management and employers can understand action plans. We use logic rather than the more emotional standpoint. So there's a certain coldness to the managerial, managing by numbers. Let's say if a program at KVCC was going to get cut, the numbers speak to that. And so a decision is made, and it's based on logic and numbers. It's not based usually on the kind of numbers, on the emotions, that would be entailed in there. Those may have to be addressed, but the decision is made based on logic. It's rational. There's thinking in it, as opposed to the emotionality of these things. It's empirical, and we're using standardized methods of collecting data, analyzing data, using statistics, and drawing conclusions from those statistics. So empirical. Issues such as work ethic, which predates Taylorism, but became one of the factors that was important in terms of hiring somebody. So questions in the interview started to examine issues of work ethic. It wasn't just ability to do the job. They would actually ask questions about how do they feel about the world of work. And this is really where we get the kind of the birthing or the kind of start of calling references. The references, you might be calling someone for a previous job, but you're not asking how they're going to do the job you're hiring for them. You're asking about their work ethic. So you see this beginning way back in the turn of the century. And here we get into some really kind of terms that we understand today. Efficiency. So efficiency in terms of productivity, like how much can I get done in a particular period of time? And we sort of nonchalantly, or we sort of like say, this is how much you should get. Sorry, I said nonchalantly, but this is really supposed to be scientific. Maybe somewhat arbitrary, we would say, this is how much I should be able to get done. There are research projects that are done to determine the expected productivity of a particular job, and then individuals' personal productivity are compared to those standards. So efficiency numbers play a large role in our workplace today. Elimination of waste, and I don't mean waste products or trash or anything like that. What we're looking about is wasted time, wasted energy. That is inefficiency. It's like it's the other end of efficiency. Like an efficient engine converts most of the potential energy into kinetic energy. Whereas in efficient work systems, most of my movements, let's say, in an assembly line are the shortest path to get that job done. So there's no wasted time. Standardization. We start to see this coming up in the turn of the century. This is where we start to see standardized parts. So as more and more car manufacturers came out, they said, well, maybe we should make some standardized lug nuts. So we're all using the same kind of lug nuts. So people who are servicing our vehicles across the country don't have to carry 17 different sizes of lug nuts. Lug nuts are all the same. And so that standardization process started to begin, again, a very important part of Taylorism. The concept of best practice, which entails all of these things. It entails an analysis, synthesis, logic, a rational decision that's empirically based, that is efficient, minimizes the elimination of waste, minimizes waste, it's standard. These kinds of things, you think about those, and we come down, this is the best way to do something, or the best of a small set of how to do something, and we seek best practice. And finally, the concept of mass production. You couldn't do mass production with these things. We couldn't have best practice. You couldn't have mass production without these. It needs best practice. It needs standardization. It needs all of these other factors to produce mass production. Now, we often think of these in terms of factory work. We're envisioning an assembly line at an auto plant and all that, and certainly we do see it there. But in my personal experience, I knew someone, a good friend of mine, who was a manager at a McDonald's. And the McDonald's system is definitively based on Taylorism. So you have the McDonald's symbol here, and McDonald's, to almost an nth degree, embodies Taylorism, and with analysis and synthesis and logic, and how things get done in the store, how the store is arranged. Anybody can find their way in a McDonald's store. They know where everything is because they're all made the same. The McDonald's system, which really gave the birth to franchising and all that has happened from that point. Okay, so today we talked about the concept of Hawthorn Effect, but contextualize it in the history of the Industrial Revolution, the turn of the century, changes in analysis that resulted in a concept that we now know as Hawthorn Effect that applies both to the prediction of behavior and to research methods. And we see that some of this work that happened so long ago is still playing a major part in our workforce and in our lives at work. So hope this has been informative, and go out and you can look at these things in your own workplace and see how they apply in your lives. So make sure you subscribe, and I will see you next time.